Then the theoretical framework, the literature that supports this research, the methodological framework, that is to say how the research was designed and the instruments, the findings and discussions of these results, and finally a conclusion. And the last pages will be dedicated to to see a list of references. So first, I'm going to leave you with my partner Tomas.
The context. We were working on Fundación Celey, which is a Chilean private school that also works as a foundation. The critical incident was that students wrote exactly in their book what they were hearing, using rules from the Spanish language in order to write English words. The purpose statement, in the same sense, is that we are going to unravel the process of transcribing the sounds, the phonemes, into graphemes.
But in order to address this, we need to justify why is it important to address this issue of students misspelling. The first case is that, as most of you probably know, internet is really common right now. It's really important right now, and it's why students most probably will use English in their context. And on the internet, reading communication, it's what dominates. It's what's usually used. Same time, as we mentioned, the school works as a foundation, and the foundation follows the UDL framework. And previous literature by Young and Savage has proposed that students at risk can benefit from learning specifically spellings and GPC, which we're going to talk about later. And finally, there's been a lot of discussions about if English is reliable or not regarding their phonetics and their spelling, with authors stating that it is unreliable and inconsistent, and others, like Moratesha, that state that it is predictable, that you can predict spelling and you can teach it explicitly. And all this leads us to a research question, which is, what are the factors that are involved in vocabulary misspellings of 3rd and 4th grade high school students? And these are inside a special educational needs school when using English in an EFL context. Now we need to present the theoretical framework, the literature that is going to support this investigation. And if we're talking about a learning, teaching experience, we need to define why do we learn or how do we learn. And for this, we took from the sociocultural theory by Lev Vygotsky, in which he states that the process of human learning usually relies on the social nature, on the social context that is around, and with special emphasis on the gradual development that Kosulin also presents with mediating agents. Usually that gradual development consists of a mediating agent between the nature and the learner itself. And for this, there is a concept inside of sociocultural that is the zone of proximal development, in which it talks about the distance between the actual development that the student can have without support, but with independent problem solving, against the potential development it can have with adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers.
Next, we have another basement or core of our investigation, that is grapheme phoneme correspondence. But first, in order to define grapheme phoneme correspondence, we need to know what is a grapheme or what is a phoneme. In the first place, we have phonemes as the smallest units of the sound of a language. Then we have graphemes, which are the smallest written unit of a language, in this case, letters. So the correspondence refers to how these letters and sounds relate with each other. Here we have the symbols or letters that represents each sound of the language. In the first place, we have 44 English phonemes, which of course are one sound each, and 26 letters of the alphabet. And to juxtapose that and to imagine the complexity of the English language, we have the Spanish phonemes that are only 24 and one more letter. So, in order to dig deeper into the complexity, we have that each letter doesn't always represent the same sound. The same sound doesn't always represent the same letter. And there are sometimes letters that are called silent letters that are not pronounced. Then we have phonological awareness. This is for our students, and it's basically the ability to recognize the units of the sounds and to reflect on them and use them in the specific words, basically. With the main idea being that it's a metalinguistic ability.
And since we're talking a lot about GPC, about grammar and phonemes, we also wanted to add about interlanguage, which before talking about interlanguage, we need to define firstly native language, which is the mother tongue to say so, the language you learn, in which case we would say it's Spanish for convenience, and the target language, which is the language you attempt to learn. You're attempting, in this case, being English. And interlanguage consists of an internal system that usually students construct, which is sometimes takes rules from the native language, sometimes takes rules from the target language, and in some cases neither of them. It's arbitrary choices. And regarding this aspect of interlanguage, there is an issue that can come with it, and that is fossilization, which as the title implies, is the fossilization of inaccurate forms, or spellings in this case. And there was a case study we wanted to highlight, which was conducted by Lardier, in which a Chinese-American woman who had 20 years already in the United States living and using English in her everyday life. She was tested in some grammar aspects, and they found out that when she wrote, she didn't use the past tense. She avoided using past tense. For example, I move out in 85 and then I live by myself a year. She missed the ed suffix. And in this case, they recognize that in Chinese Mandarin, the past tense is not the same as in English. It's not used as in English. Therefore, it was hard for her to change that aspect, even though she had 20 years of using it in English. But here comes another problem, because if we're talking about inaccuracies and mistakes or errors, in this case we need to clarify, because there is a distinction between both. Mistake usually refers when someone knows the system, but omits something or uses incorrectly. However, if the person doesn't necessarily know the system or has an incorrect hypothesis, presumes something, then we can say it is an error. So for this thesis, most of the students, usually we can refer to their mistakes as errors, actually.
Next, we have special educational needs that we use in order to give or have considerations with our students, because as I said before in the context, because the school worked as a foundation, there were a lot of students that were neurodivergent. Therefore, we need to take accommodations to the instructions for the instruments that we were going to apply in our research. Then we have methodological framework. We have the type of research. There are mainly three types. One is qualitative approach. That means that it takes into consideration the experience that we had. And qualitative approach that basically takes into consideration numbers and the varieties that we can collect during our research. But we use mixed approach. This means that we use both elements from both of the research. And we did this because in order to avoid biased results, misinterpretations of events, or limitations of information, because if we didn't add one or another, the research could be lacking in some aspects. Next slide, please. And we did a case study because we did an empirical research in a certain topic, and we started to find out about theories or concepts by researching into this issue or phenomenon. And we can go to the next slide, which in certain way is an inductive method, because we came from a specific point to the more general things. We saw an issue or a phenomenon, then we discovered the theories related, and we could unravel the reasons of the phenomenon.
Now that we have settled the basis on how the research was designed, we now needed to design the instruments, the data collection instruments, and this consisted of mainly three. The first one, as we said, Thomas said, it's an empirical research, so logbook observations in the field were the first thing and the most important things. So we took notes, and then they were transferred to a logbooks. in order to maintain like a coherence between the whole theme. Afterwards, we designed some diagnostic tests, which consisted of a total of 10 questions with focus only on the vowels, on the phonemes of the vowels. For example, airport, the AI, or between with the E in the middle of between. And finally, after this diagnostic test, we introduced a survey a week later, in which instead of focusing on their performance in their skills, we wanted to measure their confidence in their spelling skills. So we divided this in two. The first one with visual cues, in which they rank from 1 to 10 how confident they feel in writing the word after they hear it from a listening cue. And without the visual cues, just listening the word, how confident they felt. However, when designing these instruments, we need to be careful that these need to be reliable and valid. In the case of reliability, as you know, reliability means consistency, that the test is consistent and the results should be consistent, so we decided to follow standardized procedures. And these procedures consisted, for example, in clearly delivering the instructions 5 minutes earlier and using ICQs, implementing ICQs for them to assure that they understood the instructions and answering any questions they had in that time. And also the audios that were used for the listening, they were pre-recorded with high quality audio equipment, and the speakers that were used were considered as well because sometimes the classroom outside can be too loud. So we need to be careful of that.
For validity, we have face validity, which is basically that is approved by an external validator, but it also means that we, in the first site, we approve that the instruments are going to basically research into the things that we want to know. Then we have construct validity. We need to keep clear that we only did research into vowels, into the phonemes of the vowels, even though phonemes are more or less about every letter or every sound. We only focus on the vowels. And the practicality or feasibility, which is basically that this the application of the instruments was possible, and basically we did it like cheap. It was easy to apply, so yeah, it has the pass on that one. For the data analysis, we have cross-validation. This is a method that is mainly used in inferential statistics and empirical research, and is basically taking into consideration variables and comparing them in order to have an hypothesis. Then we have measures of central tendencies, in which we use only mean and mode. Mean in order to calculate the average of the percentage of the score and the test takers, and the mode used to select the highest frequency in order to delete or keep away the extremes results. And that is a reason why we didn't use the median. Then we have a bar chart that we complemented with literature, and thematic analysis for the logbooks in order to dig deeper into the themes that were presented during lessons.
Now that we set all things aside clear, now we're going to talk about the results, findings, and discussions that these results had. First, as we said, the logbooks were the first instrument to be applied, and we decided to do, as Tomás said, a thematic analysis. And these themes divided into two. The first being how GPC and phonological awareness tasks were implemented in the classroom, and secondly, how the zone of proximal development was considered or was present during these lessons. In the case of, I'm going to be talking about GPC and phonological awareness tasks. The teacher first introduced the vocabulary by just presenting the words and then letting them repeat, like listen and repeat. And afterwards, in the next class, he presented tongue twisters in order for them to recognize minimal pairs. In this case, he used the phoneme in the IPA, the phoneme number 130 and 131. And finally, in the next class, we noticed an event. It was really that caught our attention, which was that the students, they had a oral presentation, and they were writing their speech exactly how with Spanish phonemes, like writing the words how they hear it. And in this case, we can see how they incorporated, in this case, multiple linguistic elements of their native language, being the Spanish phonemes, to how they sound in English, but not the spelling. Therefore, creating their internal system. And in the second part, we have the zone of proximal development, which in the first case, we had that the teacher presented a model in the tongue twister, because before giving the tongue twister to students for them to practice, he pronounced it first, for them to listen carefully and recognize the difference. Then, when they were practicing on their own, they were able to correct themselves, to have peer-to-peer feedback. And in this case, it's a lot, as mentioned before in zone of proximal development, the potential development in collaboration with more capable peers. In this case, by giving that model, it allowed students to be more capable in order to give better feedback. And finally, he also kept monitoring students, since it could lead to fossilization if bad feedback or inaccurate feedback was given.
In finding one, we have that the students have a high confidence in themselves, but it doesn't reflect in their performance, meaning that they don't have the tools in order to self-assess or basically monitor themselves in order to have a correct grammar. Then we have the finding two, in which with the support of the image they have higher confidence instead of when they didn't have. But we need to be clear with this, and we need to show everyone what the questions were asked, and this was about their confidence, in order to give a better understanding that some of the words may be difficult than others. Next one.
Now, in the finding three, which was after we decided, we researched the visual cues, we wanted to identify the diagnostic test, to analyze the diagnostic test, the answers they gave. And we noticed two major things. The first one being that there were some inconsistencies in the writing because of overgeneralizing rules. For example, in the first case, we have between with the phoneme I and building, which the only difference that they have is like it's a little longer, the phoneme. However, a student transferred the E in between to the E in building, which is not the case as we know. And in the other case, they also transferred pronunciation or spellings from the native language to the target language, in the case, for example, in airport. The student wrote it like in the Spanish form aeropuerto, aer, with the termination air. However, they recognize some other phonemes that may seem more complex, for example, in the case of light, since it sounds like a diphthong like AI. However, both students wrote the correct word, like they wrote it with an I. So this seems that, as we said, some letters don't represent the same. However, they seem to recognize some explicitly taught forms.
Good
No?
question.
So basically, we need to know.
We need to go fast.
Yes, we need to know if the answer research was if the research question was answered, and indeed was answered because of the inconsistencies. One factor that affects English spellings in students is because of the inconsistency of the English language. As we saw, there's almost a double of phonemes than in Spanish, with the same with even less alphabet. And the interlanguage, which leads to interlanguage of students changing forms and taking arbitrary decisions to form the language. And also, it seems that students struggle with self-assessing their spellings. However, even though we couldn't address if confidence and skill was related, we saw that visual cues increase their confidence. As there are other types of mediation, not only with human beings, but also in organized learning activities.
Summary. So we have the aim, we wanted to report on the students transfer audio to written form. The research question was what factors are involved in vocabulary in spellings of third and fourth grade high school students in an EFL context. The justification of why researching this topic was the use of the internet, the use of UDL framework in the school, and basically that there is an ongoing discussion of the English language that if it is consistent or not. The key concepts were GPC, phonological awareness, zone of proximal development, interlanguage, and fossilization. Then we have the research design. We use elements from empirical research. It was an explanatory case study because, as we saw before, we researched on a certain problem. it was an inductive approach. We start from the problem, developing new ideas, and the mix method that mixes qualitative and quantitative data. Then, yeah, we can continue.
And now we have to talk about the implications that the study had. What implies all this? First, the major concern that we found out was that if we consider effective communication to be the goal of teaching English, misspellings like this can lead to a lot of issues because the message is distorted and therefore it allows for misinterpretation of the listener. Therefore, rendering useless effective communication. There is no effective communication. And this means that, for example, visual cues should be implemented when teaching, for example, phonological awareness, since it seems to increase their confidence. Although, even though, as I said before, we didn't correlate it with skills, it is for further research to address that.
Yeah.
And also, exceptions to the rules, as we mentioned, should be explicitly taught because students tend to overgeneralize things and transfer one rule to the other. And exceptions, as I said, should be explicitly taught.
So we have the study limitations. In the first place, it was meant to be an action plan. We were thinking about doing interventions using a GBC model. The original research question was, to what degree can a phonic approach impact students' spelling? But we didn't have the opportunity to do it because a school strike. Limited literature in EFL. GBC is mainly used in L1 context, is not used in L2 as much, but when it's used, it has been proven that it's positive, and we also wanted to replicate that in here, and that they were online students, but we didn't research with them because we didn't have tools in order to manage what they were basically doing, or how we collect the data from them. For further research, we recommend that using interventions using a GPC approach that don't use the sociocultural theory from Vygotsky, but it can use a constructivism approach because the students are going to receive a lot of input and they need to build with that input instead of just receiving input, receiving input, receiving input. Also, this, to give in mind the sample, because we have not many students as a normal school in Chile, and time restraints. For the pedagogical reflection, there are vulnerable sectors in Chile that tend to have a certain accent or they use more sounds than others. And we can change that by having a focus on the L1 sounds. And the reason for this are mainly economical, but we can, if we give a peace of mind for the L1 sounds in order to develop next the L2 sounds, we can make a change and avoid discrimination for this.
And on the other hand, by considering now that we know that the English language is on itself inconsistent with the spelling, and that students tend to overgeneralize their rules, we can, as teachers, prepare better materials and also put ourselves in the position of the student who seems to think that they want to know a set of rules. However, it is more complex than that. So we can better prepare for that and design content that is prepared for them, not for us, to understand basically. Not for the teacher, but for the student. And now our final remarks on this presentation and the overall presentation. The contributions that all this research had on us was, firstly, we had a better understanding on phonological awareness, the concept of phonological awareness in students, and especially in the EFL context, which as we said, there isn't a lot of literature or isn't too concise. Also, as we said before, we never found a correlation between confidence and performance. However, it is something really important to add because there can be a key on it. There can be a really important aspect there. And we hope that this research help future researchers of GPC to avoid, for example, the mistakes we made or to correct things that could have been gone better. And also for future EFL teachers to design better materials, as I said, for GPC and phonological awareness tests. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Okay,
We have the reference
Ours.
here.
And the list of references with the authors used in the presentation.
muchas gracias Tomás y Carlos.